Everyone, welcome. We'll give everyone just a second to get settled. It's nice to see so many faces here today. If you're not already muted, I recommend muting your mic just so we don't get background noise hopping around, but there will be a chance at the end to ask questions and to unmute yourself. So I promise that that's coming. All right, I think everyone has made it in from the waiting room, and I know a few people are running a little bit late, so I'll keep an eye on that, but we can get started. So welcome everyone. My name is Sophie Block. I'm the director of Hillels of Memphis, and I'm so excited to be with you here today for our virtual learning series that features a different Jewish faculty member from our local universities every other week. We've been doing this all of this semester and all of last semester, and it's been going so well. And I know Beverly in a lot of other capacities, and I'm so excited that she's here to speak to us in this capacity today. So as many of you know, this week's lecturer is Professor Beverly Tsacoyianis. Did I say that right? Ish? Okay.
Tsacoyianis.
Tsacoyianis. Nice. Okay. She's the associate professor at the University of Memphis Department of History. She got her PhD in history at University of Washington in St. Louis in 2014. And her areas of expertise are modern Middle East, Islamic history, 20th century global and comparative history, history of science and medicine, Israel and Palestine, and gender and sexuality studies. So on that note, I would like to officially invite our speaker to take the mic and tell us all about what you have to share today.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, I am trying to figure out how to move my script over from this laptop to my desktop so that I don't have to be constantly going back and forth, but I'm not seeing how to do that. So, sorry, maybe I'll just have to read from it while I'm also on the same laptop. Okay. Okay, well, first, I'm glad that some folks jumped in that I haven't seen in a while. This is the fun thing about Facebook, is that you can like get folks in different time zones, and that's really cool. And it's also great to see some familiar faces that are in the Memphis area currently. But I am going to do my screen share so you can have something to look at besides all our gorgeous faces. And this is the document. Let me go to the beginning. Are you guys seeing the, okay, good. So this, and oh gosh, but now I have to figure out why it's not showing my script in my saved documents. Oh, hold on. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I can't figure out why this isn't saving. I'm trying to save this on OneDrive so that I can have this open on this computer while I'm also on my laptop. Sorry, Sophie, I'm trying to, okay, why?
No problem.
Okay.
It's a Friday, we're casual here, right, everyone?
I hope so, because I had like 2 other meetings this morning with the department, and I was like scrambling to finish this. Okay, I think this time it should save over there. Okay. I don't have a webcam on my desktop computer, so I do this from my laptop. Okay. Not showing up. It's like saving in the wrong spot. Okay, this is going to be tricky because I'm not sure how to share my screen while I'm reading. Sorry, I'm just going to mute for a second to figure this out.
Would it be helpful if I shared the PowerPoint on my screen?
Yeah, it just keeps saying there's an unexpected error that's keeping me from copying the files. I don't know why. It's something wrong with the cloud saving it. Okay, I think now it's opening. Hopefully it's the most updated version. Okay, let's try this again. Okay. Okay. Oh, there's a, oh, did you, okay. So thank you, now we start. Thank you, Sophie, for inviting me to speak on the On One Foot lecture series. I'm sure many of you are familiar with why that's a phrase about, the rest is commentary, go and study. So definitely I'm not the, definitive last, end all kind of authority on what I'm going to be talking about today, but I have a particular perspective that's coming from the data that I've been working with, and I do recommend you guys read into, kind of delve more deeply into a lot of the material that I'm talking about by going out and reading some of the other material that I'm connecting to in terms of historical fiction and other research that's gone into this field. I already talked about how I recognize a few of you, and it's good to see you even though it's virtual. And I want to start first by mentioning, like Sophie said, that I am a historian. So my PhD was from Washington University in St. Louis, and I've been here at the University of Memphis in the history department since right before I finished my PhD in 2014. And so I teach courses here in Middle Eastern, Islamic, and world history. But in both my research and my teaching, I approach topics through kind of an interdisciplinary space with fields like trauma studies, disability studies, and international studies. So for me, that's meant that along with the more, quote unquote, traditional primary sources that a historian of the 20th century would use, like newspaper records, journal articles, memoirs, letters, and then also along with the traditional primary sources that a psychiatric or medical historian would use, like hospital records. I also analyze sources like journalistic nonfiction, creative works in literature and film and music, and data from the field of medical anthropology, including ethnographies. And I really enjoy seeing kind of the diverse ways, the diverse records and approaches, and how those can really bring us a more nuanced connection to topics as complex and multi-layered as faith and health and conflict. And so some of you may have arrived at this meeting today through this flyer that I'm showing on the screen that was on Facebook that looks like this. And if you clicked on the Zoom registration, you may have seen an earlier title that I put up here at the top there, Conflicted Healing, Psychiatry, Jinn, and War in Syrian and Lebanese History. And I, many of you may know that historians are fans of the academic colon. And so we'll put something kind of deceptively simple sounding or suggestive of layers before the colon, in this case, conflicted healing, and in my book title, Disturbing Spirits. And then after the colon, we'll put something more specific. And I did do that with the book and the earlier version of the title, but Sophie helped me kind of make it a little bit less clunky with the just faith and healing. But I have a reason for why I've framed it this way, why you have the word conflict and conflicted, and the word disturbing in there. It's so that you can kind of immediately see those words and hold those in your mind of conflict, of disturbing, while you're also looking at words like healing and spirits. And there's, healing, it's not just a single moment, it's really a process, it's a transformation from one space to another. And spirits has a double meaning in my book about the nature of illness and the nature of treatment and how they are approached in historiography, how historians have written about these issues. So I put the cover of my book here. I also put a link to the press page if you guys here, maybe I'll click on it and put it in the chat just in case folks haven't already seen it on my Facebook page. I'll put it over here. I'm just going to stop share for a second so I can put it in the chat because I'm actually not sure how to put stuff in chat that's while I'm doing a screen share. Let's see. So the slideshow. Okay, so the book, the covers right here is called Disturbing Spirits, Mental Illness, Trauma, and Treatment in Modern Syria and Lebanon. Should I click admit on that? Okay. So let me see. So the title hints at two major themes in my research in this book. The first is that 20th century Syrians and Lebanese believed a supernatural world of spirits mingled with the natural world of human beings, and that spirits, jinn among them, but also there are others like Efrit, that could cause physical and mental disturbances, even illnesses in people. And that is a disease etiology that's rooted in the belief that the supernatural and natural worlds can influence each other. That a person might conjure or exercise a spirit should they know the proper way to do it, and that a spirit might possess a person should the spirit be so moved. And supernatural ideas about mental illness are the main focus of the beginning part of my book, chapter 1, and it builds on research by other scholars that have worked in modern and medieval history about the Mediterranean and the Islamic world more generally, as well as material that's in other parts of the kind of contemporary period, like Barbara Drieskin's ethnographic research in Cairo in the 1990s. And really one of the most important takeaways from my book is that those supernatural ideas were not at all unique to Muslims. There were Christians and Jews throughout the Mediterranean, from Morocco to Turkey and beyond, that had spirit-based or supernatural ideas, but these worldviews were disturbed. So, and this is part of where the term disturbing is coming from, disturbing spirits. The worldviews are disturbed and marginalized, derided by some advocates of the natural sciences, especially by medical doctors and psychiatrists in the early 20th century. And this is not a foreign idea either for Yiddish or Ladino speaking communities. I'm just going to jump quickly so that you can see, I'll come back to this slide in a second, but you see this kind of thing also in Mizrahi communities and in Ladino and Yiddish speaking communities. So as you might know, the story about the Dibuk, you might have heard of the film Shul, which is an Israeli film that has a Moroccan family and these kinds of what they call white magic, which is what the word shul comes from. But you also see this in the Bedouin communities, in the Negev. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Oops. Oh, I just clicked. I have a lot of embedded links in these. So it comes back to, okay, so there really are supernatural beings in a whole range of cultural frameworks. This is not at all unique to Syria or Lebanon. And some of these beings, like the golem or the dibuk, if you're familiar with the Ashkenazi kind of supernatural ideas, are malevolent, and some may be involved in protective capacities for a community. So this idea of spirits that can disturb is one of the two meanings of the title, Disturbing Spirits. And then the other meaning actually comes from trauma theory. So that the major political, economic, and social transformations of the 20th century in Lebanon and Syria disturbed the psyche or emotional well-being of ordinary Lebanese and Syrian people, whether any one individual among them had a pre-existing medical or psychological condition or not. So there are layers as well in this, in how people are being treated and how they react differently to different circumstances. So it really, the aspect of the trauma theory connects to this quote that I have here, which is from the American-born lawyer Alia Malek, who wrote in her book, The Home That Was Our Country, a memoir of Syria, that the Syrian civil war had, I'm just gonna click to admit, okay. The Syrian civil war had reached a level of violence, and this is the quote on the slide, violence that would consume it whole and eventually damage the collective mental health of its people. And you know, it is a feeling of intense soul-destroying damage that we might sense when we watch Philippe Araktingi's 2007 docudrama Sous les bombes, which is French, it means Under the Bombs, about the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah that destroyed so much of South Lebanon. And I was actually in Beirut for a language program during that, but I ask me later about the evacuation and everything, but that intense sense of loss of this shattered self, a shattered family. If you've seen that film, it's a very difficult film to get through, but it gives you some of the, even us as outsiders, this sense of the loss that comes from being involved in a war like this. And oh, sorry, I was getting distracted with some of the cameras. But there's this intense sense of loss, a shattered self, a shattered family, even a shattered nation. So with these two meanings in mind, I'm just gonna minimize a little bit so that I can, sorry. With these two meanings of spirit in mind, the religious or supernatural and the psychiatric or psychological, My book argues that tensions developed between vernacular healers and psychiatrists, while political transformations since the late 1800s devastated collective and individual psyches and disrupted social order. And while healers may have a goal to do no harm, whether biomedical or popular, practitioners can themselves cause trauma in their patients or clients. And biomedical explanations of health and wellness threaten to promote the replicating of a standard or ideal body at the expense of atypical ones. And supernatural understandings of jinn or demonic possession as explanation for abnormal or brutally violent behavior, especially in situations of intense conflict between people or communities, threatens to absolve humans of accountability or to remove human action from the political and cultural conditions which shape human agency. And this is where my work really intervenes in the historiography, where I'm really making a claim for a new way of thinking about the past. My work seeks to make space for both systems. So in other words, for us to gain a more complete picture of mental health treatment in early 20th century Syria and Lebanon, we must consider the political context of natural and supernatural understandings of mental illness. That means there isn't really a true binary between foreign and local spaces of knowledge and practice. And to paraphrase Matthew Heaton in his work on Nigeria, we must break down artificial dichotomies between colonizer and colonized, between modern and traditional, between science and belief. Neither Lebanon nor Syria was entirely successful in replacing supernatural etiologies of illness with natural ones. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not even a physician. I'm a historian only. But I don't think it's a historian's place to decide what is true or not when it comes to religious beliefs or practices. And quite the opposite, actually. I see my role as one where I need to understand why a community finds a particular practice meaningful, not whether or not a jinni or jinniya was there that day. And anyone who has studied psychiatric history will tell you that, sorry, whenever I stop like that is because I want to make sure that we're letting in folks that want to catch up. But anyone who's studied psychiatric history will tell you that even in biomedical spaces, there have been inaccuracies, some of them really awful, like scientific racism or Freudian ideas about women's brains and bodies and hysteria from the wandering uterus. Or the whole debacle of 1950s lobotomies and leucotomies, or electroshock or even electroconvulsive treatment for people physicians diagnosed as quote unquote incurable schizophrenics. So it's not like the biomedical and psychiatric framework or the religious framework has, neither has a perfect kind of approach to understanding what to do here. My duty as a historian is to present a narrative about the past, about how it created legacies in the present. And absolutely in the present, people still pray for healing. People may still visit a sheikh. When I was in Amman in Jordan just 4 years ago, and I explained a bit about my data collection to my driver at the French Institute, he asked me if I'd like to go see an exorcism because he knew about one that was coming up later that week. And I actually declined because, to be honest, I don't know if they exist or not, and I don't want to be an available host should there really have been a jinni pulled out looking for somewhere to go. And I didn't tell him that, but the thought definitely crossed my mind. But also in a more grounded way, I considered that sort of a visit unethical on my part because I had not asked for IRB approval for that kind of research. My research on that trip, for the institutional review board approval that I got, was specifically to interview psychologists and psychiatrists and physicians about healing practices. And I had not requested to work with patients. And I would consider the body of the person the sheikh sees as possessed to be a patient. So that's the main reason I tell people why I didn't go, but it is a little spooky. I don't want to drop into a situation like that. But anyway, so let me take you back to 1923. There was a Catholic priest near Jerusalem who published a short piece in French about an exorcist in Nablus in British Mandate Palestine. And his name was, the sheikh, the exorcist was Sheikh Saad ad-Din Jabawi. And so that's the name I have here. Oops. On this slide. And Jossin, the priest, wrote, and I translated it into English here, and I put this quote up on the slide, that he heals all diseases. Not all diseases have the same origin. Some have ordinary causes, like kind of a galenic humoral theory approach, being too cold or too hot, and you would heal by opposite, by kind of giving someone who's too cold something warm to drink, that sort of thing. But then there are other causes that would be engendered by the evil eye. And then this third category is of the jinn, the kind of spirit of fire that is unseen, which is different from a ghost in kind of Christian ideas, by the way. But there are people like a Jabawi who see themselves as able to heal things like evil eye problems or jinn problems. And you also see that kind of approach with, just going to jump to this guy, the Darwish, the healers in the Negev. And then this guy with the long coat is an example of a famous, well, he's Abu Badr, who's a famous dervish in the Negev. And then the author of this book here, Indigenous Medicine about the Bedouin in the Middle East, Arif Abu Rabia, that's him there. He had kind of studied with him for over 15 years. So you have evil eye from a human being, and this is familiar to people all over the world. This is not unique to the Mediterranean, but there may be jealousy or a wish for misfortune on someone else. And that could have, it could even come from someone who admired somebody with seemingly only good intentions. So if you admire something about a person, like, oh, you have such a healthy child, a healthy baby, but you don't say a blessing right after you speak this way, you could bring evil eye on the child. And so if it's not good, that can be something that could lead to the child falling ill, any number of health problems in people or animals. Or problems with a relationship. Like if you say, oh, you guys get along so well together, that could, and you're not careful about how you say it, that could cause trouble in the relationship. So that's seen as a problem coming from the evil eye. And you see, I saw mention of this kind of treatment in Syrian psychiatric records that I first accessed at a hospital near Damascus in 2009 and 2010, before the Civil War, about a patient in 1927 who sought treatment first at their home in Saydnaya before they were admitted to the hospital. And then in 1946, a different patient was released to a family member for treatment at their house in Damascus. You also see this in records from the Lebanese hospital called Asfuriya, which has since closed. But in 1909, local elders gave these psychiatric patients amulets that were wrapped. I'm just going to jump so you can see an example of the kinds of amulets that I'm talking about here. This one in the middle here, this is the kind of amulet that you would see. And it happens also in Palestine and Israel. So this one happens to be from a Palestinian family, but you would see similar things with magical numbers and incantations. And in Arabic at the top, it says Allah Latif, so God is gentle, to try and help heal people. I'm just gonna jump back. Sorry, I have a lot of slides in here and I don't want to overwhelm people, but so I'm just gonna, okay, so you would see, for example, what we've called, or what scholars have called, here I'm going to jump to it, traditional Arabic and Islamic medicine, which has its roots in a lot of different healing systems. So you'll see, for example, in this slide, you've got Islamic medicine over here under the religious influences coming from the Islamic world. You have Islamic medicine, you have prophetic tradition, which comes from practices that people associated with the Prophet Muhammad from the 7th century of the Common Era. But you also would see regional healing systems that were based in other traditions. So Ayurvedic, coming from the Indian subcontinent, traditional Chinese medicine, which is what TCM is here, Persian, and Unani, which is Greek medicine. And you can see all these arrows, everything interlocked. I mean, people along the Silk Road for centuries were traveling and exchanging ideas about healing. And all of those together make what traditional Arabic and Islamic medicine is. And this is this chart comes from some scholars, Dr. Sara Arawi and Michael Fetters, who've worked in this field and published on this. So this is from one of their publications. So you have the roots here coming from a lot of different places. And then you can end up with things that focus on medicine specific to herbs like chamomile tea, dietary practices like fasting, therapy that you might call mind and body, like prayer or chanting, spiritual healing that could involve somebody reciting prayer over you, and then applied therapy like massage or cupping or water therapies. And all of that falls under Arabic and Islamic medicine, but you may recognize some of these as also complementary and alternative medicine practices, so CAM practices. I'm just going to jump back because I do want to talk a little bit about the cover here. So the book cover, I got this idea from an artist named Anas Homsi, who's from Syria. He went to school in Damascus. He was born in 1987. And he and his wife is Syrian, half Lebanese. They met in Lebanon when he had already become a refugee. They are now, they've sought asylum in Germany, and they have a young child. A son is just a little younger than my boys. And he gave me permission to kind of adapt this painting of his called Wall of Memories that he did in 2015 when he was already in Lebanon for the book design. And it was sold at an auction to a buyer in the United States, actually. But this is Anas, and part of the work that I do as a historian is to talk about what's happened in the past. But I also, because this material hits me really personally, because I lived in Syria for almost a year when I was doing my research, and I made a lot of friends, and this is part of why I have this in the acknowledgements. Where I talk about how my husband and I have, since I first worked on this project, first started working on it, we've had 2 children, and we see them grow in a place where there is easy access to urgent care, clean food and water, safe shelter, antibiotics, vaccines. But it's so hard to think about the people that I met in Lebanon and Syria who have lost their children, or who have intergenerational trauma from survivors of earlier wars. And I really have such fond memories of good people and compassionate healers in Lebanon and Syria. And so part of what I do is to try and honor some of those memories. And that's part of why I have this at the bottom of my acknowledgements, that kind of famous prayer that some of you may be familiar with: may we see the day when war and bloodshed cease, when a great peace will embrace the whole world. And this section here is just an overview of my table of contents. So the book really starts with the explanations that I'm giving you now about vernacular healing, and then it moves to some of the medical institutions and the like medical schools, and then hospitals, and then it ends with a focus on literature, particularly with the Lebanese Civil War and the Syrian Civil War. So obviously the Lebanese Civil War that started in 1975 and ended in 1990, but the Syrian Civil War is ongoing now for more than 10 years. One of the ways that people cope with it, with the immense loss and the tragedy of it all, is that they write historical fiction, many times because they are worried. I'm talking about Syrian and Lebanese authors, like the ones that let me see where I put them. These folks here. So Hanana Sheikh is from Lebanon. Anas Abu Ismail is a physician here in the United States now, but his family is in Syria. Alia Malek is an American-born Syrian lawyer, the one that I was quoting from about the collective mental health. And Samar Yazbek is Syrian and Alawi. So she's from the same religious sect that the current dictator, Bashar al-Assad, is from. And so she's also in a very kind of dangerous situation where now that the civil war has kind of devolved into sectarian warfare, she's marked as someone who is an enemy, even though she's on the side of survivors. She's not on the side of the government. But for many of these people, Yazbek has written these 2 books, which are journalistic nonfiction, but Anas Abu Ismail and Alia Malek both wrote these as, well, Malek's is kind of a memoir and an autobiography, but Anas Abu Ismail's book and Hanana Sheikh's 2 books over here are both historical fiction, in part to protect their families and to avoid the challenges that can come with speaking out too openly about the regimes under which their families suffered. So let me see where I'm at here with so I'm just going to skip over some of this because I don't want to take up too much time, but the tricky thing about some of the material here is that not everyone that is a healer, whether psychiatric or vernacular, truly means to do no harm. Some may have kind of vested interests in portraying a community a certain way. And this is one of the reasons that I had this slide here about why should we care about what kind of research Bev is doing here. So there are a lot of different topics that overlap with this. So I'm interested in the colonial project that happened in Syria and Lebanon under the French control after World War I. I'm also interested in nationalism and how the post-colonial states in Lebanon and Syria were really trying to create a strong body and a strong state, which needed to be built with strong bodies and strong minds. And what happened to people that, you know, didn't fit that rubric was often tragic. So there is a way in which disability and illness is seen as a threat to order. And so the different ways that governments handle that is one of the focuses of my kind of research. So I'm really trying to ask, who is sick? Who decides that? What is effective treatment, and who decides that, and why? And so a lot of this overlaps, and you may, for those of you that work in other fields, like you may see parallels or ways in which these questions resonate in a lot of different communities, not just in Syria and Lebanon. And this is just an example of some of the sources that I've worked with medical records, literary and cultural that I've talked about, and the media. There's also a way in which what I'm talking about here with healing has contemporary significance for American and Canadian and European health workers. And it's partly because there are people who have some of these frameworks for illness in this country. And so there's a study from 2014 that was by a kinesiologist and a sociologist team in Canada that was researching the Quran, which is the sacred text in Islam, to dispel ideas about a Quranic basis connecting insanity to jinn possession, so being possessed by a demon, kind of. And they did not deny the existence of jinn, and that's really important because in the Quran, there's a whole chapter about jinn. So if you say that they don't exist, then you would be seen as kind of blasphemous. And so that's really, you're not going to be able to develop a relationship of trust with your patients if they are firm believers in a religious concept that you dismiss right off the bat. And that's part of what made psychiatric attempts at healing in Lebanon and Syria fail ultimately in the 20th century, because they had these frameworks that were kind of delegitimizing or marginalizing the cultural worldviews of their patients. And so the kinesiologist sociologist team actually were not denying the existence of jinn. Instead, they were trying to dispel the stigma that mental illness has had in a lot of Muslim communities. And they're trying to dispel the mistrust. They're trying to dispel the mistrust of medical professionals, to try and have medical professionals from similar backgrounds of the patients, or at least respect the background of the patient, so that they would work more closely together. And so that's one of the reasons that they were trying to point out that in the Quran, there were ways in which you didn't see the jinn cause the illness. And so they're just going to jump a little bit past some of these. Oh, sorry, I think this is not the most updated version of okay, so I would just tell you a little bit about the other records that I posted in here. So those of you who know anything about other healing systems would be familiar with this idea that there is a supernatural and a natural. And there are ways in which people may find something therapeutic in something like prayer. And so there's no clear boundary between foreign or local, biological, and supernatural. These, I already talked about this and this. I'm going to jump past some of the kind of more nuts and bolts about my research, unless people want to see a little bit about it. But these are, this is just a map showing where the two main mental hospitals were in Syria. And they still are. I mean, it's actually, since the war began, it's become a complete kind of mess in terms of the patients that were already there and people who need more help. But I will just show you some examples of the sources I've been working with. So this is, this report over here is from the Lebanon Hospital for the Insane, which was the one that was called Asforia. It actually closed after the Israelis bombed it in 1983. But there are other mental hospitals in Lebanon, but they're all private, and there's only 3 of them. And that's the kind of best case scenario for the ratio of patients to doctors in the Middle East. And so part of the argument I have has to do with the continued success or perseverance of trust in faith healing. In part has to do with the lack of accessibility of psychiatric approaches to healing. Oh, there's something in the chat. Sorry, hold on. I'm not sure how to get to the chat. Oh, I'm sorry, Susan, that you had a serious arm injury. You know, I don't know. I've never done any research into the efficacy of the healing amulets, but some of it is really, you know, it's worth trying certain things, particularly now. I think that this country has had such a serious opioid crisis. I would recommend that people kind of be very careful about what goes into their bodies. I mean, so for example, when you talk about tinctures, you can have the tincture in and of itself is not dangerous. You can make, you could write on a leaf of basil a verse from the Quran or any sacred text that a person is connected to. You could use the stem of a leaf, I mean the stem of a plant that's not poisonous, and dip it in honey and write on the basil or on some other, you know, chamomile, and drink it. And that's like an herbal tea. There is some, you know, the vernacular healers would imbue some sacred magical healing properties to the fact that what you wrote was from the sacred text. But from kind of a, you know, chemical perspective, the use of honey and a safe to ingest leaf for a tincture like that would cause no harm. So there are ways in which you can kind of think of it in those ways. So yeah, maybe a healing amulet or a tincture might help you with your arm. But I wanted, I really don't understand why my laptop was like freezing up when I was trying to finish these slides this morning, and then it looks like the wrong version of my presentation saved on the bigger computer. But I'm going to jump to this other image here. So among the healing practices you could kind of connect to would have been cautery. So burning, and in some, you know, you can think of ways in like the early modern world where burning could have been useful for an open wound to prevent infection. But the kind of cautery that you were seeing in the early 1900s in Lebanon and Palestine and Syria would be connected to the area that hurt. So for Susan's arm, they would maybe burn a section of your arm. For the person who was having maybe delusions, they would burn. So this Christian guy had a cross burned on his head because that's where they felt that the problems were coming from his mind. And so that image is from a report from the Lebanese hospital from 1923. But there are also ways in which the kind of physical damage could come from the destruction of the body politic, like the national body. And so that's why I have this kind of political cartoon from 1929. And this drawing actually has, it says the kind of funny, sad, and mudhik mubki, but it's written as if they're coming from trees, like the letters are twigs and leaves. But underneath it says the Syrian question under surgical treatment or medical treatment. And it shows a man saying, so you have these two French guys with these white doctor, you know, lab coats, and they've got top hats hanging on the hooks on the back, and these European style jackets. But look what they're using for the surgery. It's a saw. it's not gonna be helping. And then Syria is personified as this potentially drugged female patient that is kind of vulnerable. And then you have this man on the end here who is visibly kind of obese in an unhealthy way, pointing, but not being very helpful. So he's just kind of saying, oh, hey, don't, if you want to leave, and I translated it over here because it's in Arabic underneath, but please, if you want to help us, don't leave this mess. It'll create another. And so they're really saying like, this specific image shows up in 1929 when there's a debate between the French and Syrian officials about whether France will give a section of what had been Syrian to Turkey. And then they do end up doing it. So there's this carving away of the territory. And the argument in the image is also that these French people imagine that they know how to fix the area, but really what they've done is made it worse. And that's part of the ways in which you can think of health as a metaphor for the society, and that the nation has been wounded by these colonial legacies. I'm going to jump past some of this, but these are just examples of where I saw in the records the ideas that were coming from the cultural framework of evil spirits rather than the medical framework. And some of the directions that I'm taking this research has to do with what to do about the legacies, how to cope with the tragedies. So the traumas inflicted on patients who are, you can see them as kind of consumers or ex-patients or survivors of the hospitals, and also the trauma and survivors, the trauma inflicted on survivors of the Lebanese and Syrian civil war. So this is why I have this quote here about, so there's a film by Nadine Lebaki, who's a Lebanese filmmaker, and she has a movie called Where Do We Go Now, about how to deal with the past and how to move forward. And Thomas Alcacer has a chapter in a book about, he calls it, see, it's more of that academic colon I was telling you about, tense past, cultural essays in trauma and memory. So there's really this theory of victimhood that every group nurses, that our community was victimized, and a politics of blame in which every group really vies with another for this kind of moment of righteous indignation, and how that group's victimization trumps the others, and how that justifies what to do next. So I also included, this is really tough material to work with. Feel free to look away because it's really hard to work with some of this, but this is a drawing by a 7-year-old Syrian child after some cluster bombs killed some of his friends. And you'll see that the dead children are smiling, and the ones that are alive are crying. And this connects also to what Anas Abu Ismail had written in his, so this is the nephrologist that works in the United States, that he wrote about this peculiar comfort in that unyielding cuddle of death, that people are just exhausted. And then this is another image here from an article on CNN about how Syria's traumatized refugee children are the ones expected to rebuild the country, where there's this image here where it says color here. And that's the one that the Mercy Corps workers were working with in terms of art therapy. And then in this side was a blank section, and he said, now draw here whatever you want. And he's drawing cluster bombs and dead bodies. I also wanted to just quickly talk a little bit about my next project, in case some of that material was not sad enough. I also work on Palestinian and Israeli psychiatric history. And this is just part of some of the sources I've been working with. So you already saw Shul show up on one of the slides. This Hana Azuleh Hasfari is Moroccan, well, she's Sabra, she was born in Israel, but her family was from Morocco. And this film talks a little bit about her sister, Benina, who was treated with Shul, this kind of white magic back when they were in Morocco, but then is kind of left in a non-rehabilitative space of an Israeli psychiatric hospital in the 70s. I also have material from Amos Oz, like his book, A Tale of Love and Darkness. I'm sure you're familiar with what happened to his mother when actually there was a kind of a whole lot of Ashkenazi women committing suicide in the 1950s in Israel. And Dalia Würzburg-Roffe has a book, has a chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Psychiatric Ethics. She's part of the MAD rights movement in Israel. And Yasmin Snonu has done a lot of research with the Gazan Community Mental Health Program. Rosine Nimemeyu wrote some historical fiction that was based on two family members of hers who were put in the mental hospital in Bethlehem. And then also Mamadou Haftile, who is Israeli Palestinian, and wrote, kind of developed this film about his father, who was a faith healer in the Galilee. So these are just more examples of the kinds of sources that I've been working with, where you see memoirs, you see the CSX accounts, those are consumers, survivors, ex-patients, film, historical fiction. And so really it comes back to these ideas that I had in my first project, the book that's almost out and we're just finishing up the index now, and the page proofs are all nice and it looks great. But the next project is kind of connecting again with these ideas about who belongs in a community and who decides that someone is in need of intervention, of being controlled, of being monitored, of being placed in a certain space. And how do we decide which narrative is legitimate? Like, do you give the most power to the able-bodied, the temporarily able-bodied person who looks a certain way, who speaks a certain way, who is a kind of a quote-unquote productive member of society by some economic standard? And what happens to those who fall outside of that ideal space? And so that's also where I have some of these other, and this, for those of you who are more kind of familiar with American spaces, I recommend this film, Intelligent Lives by Dan Habib, because it really shows a little bit about how you can integrate into society individuals who, 50 years ago were shunted off into hospitals or lobotomized or just made to feel that they didn't deserve to exist. And so there are connections here also to the eugenics movement in terms of the early 20th century. These are records from the mental hospital in Bethlehem in Palestine from 1946, but we don't have to go into too much more of this because I know that we're kind of running short. Oh, there was something in the chat. Hold on. Oh, yes, thank you, Rachel. Yeah, and so this next project, I really, I'm not sure. So I've been to Israel twice since I started the second project in 2017, 2019. And the second time I was kind of grilled a bit, so I'm not sure if I'm going to be allowed back in. But if I do, this is the direction that I would be going. So visiting some pilgrimage sites that have been places associated with healing. I also had this really sweet, I don't know if I'll be able to play it. Maybe I'll send this I'll send the slides to Sophie, and then if people want to click on it. Part of the work that I do, that I did in my first book and that I want to do in this next project is to talk about how people cope with these very, very traumatic issues. And so some of it is through music. And Shoshana Damari was a Yemeni singer that moved to Israel as a child. And she, has this song that I think is a really powerful way of connecting to historiography. So I wonder maybe if I have a minute to try and get this to share for you guys. I don't think I'm going to be able to. Hold on. Hold on. I think there's a way on Zoom to. Okay, so advanced sharing options. Oh, Sophie, do you remember how to include the sound on sharing?
Yeah, if you press share your screen when it shows you all the different options on the bottom left, there will be a
perfect
box that says
okay, sound. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna here.
כל כך הרבה מילים אתה
for those of you not fluent in Hebrew, she's singing. This guy, we can talk about this guy's appropriation of different styles at some other point, Idan Reichel. But Shoshana Damari is singing all these words you don't say. I would collect them so we would be able to remember or recognize.
כל כך הרבה שנים אתה מדבר, שותק לרגע עד לרגע אחר. על מה אתה חושב כשאתה לא מקשיב? אני איתך עכשיו שקט מסביב. על מה אתה חושב כשאתה לא מקשיב? עלה ניסה ברוח, מתרומם, נופל על השביל. יושבים ביחד ושקט מסביב.
So we don't have time to go into the whole thing, but part of it, you may have noticed her accent, like she speaks with a Mizrahi accent, and there's a tragedy that's layered into this about the silence of what happened to Jews of non-Ashkenazi backgrounds when in the early founding of the Jewish state of Israel in the early 1950s or late 1940s. So what she's saying here is not, she wasn't meaning to explain it in the way that I appropriated for my project, but it is this, you can think of it as people are sitting, and from like a historiographic perspective, people are giving a certain narrative for so many years. And then she's coming from this other space, and she wonders, what is it that you're thinking about when you're not listening? There are so many words you don't say. I would have collected them so I could remember. So it's really, for me, that's one of the aspects of the work I'm doing, is to give, make space for those voices that have been kind of made to be silent, even if they have still been speaking, but others aren't listening. And so that's kind of the direction that my next project is going, by looking at trauma studies in Israel and Palestine. But this first project is just about done. So I'm supposed to be doing book tours, but with COVID and everything, it's just mostly Zoom things. But and next time I will try and remember to upload the most up-to-date version of it. But really the way I end this material when I'm speaking about it is to talk about how you can connect psychiatric history and kind of Middle Eastern history more generally to trauma studies and disability studies in a way that gives more agency for the individuals who have been on the receiving end of a lot of the trauma, and who have been kind of victimized, whether it was Lebanese or Syrian intellectuals under the French government control of the region after World War I, or kind of more recent issues with the Syrian Civil War and the Lebanese Civil War. But I did also include a quote from Mamdouh Haftile's movie, his kind of about his father, who's a sheikh healer, and he also is a dream interpreter. And one of the last things his father says in the film is that, God willing, you will find relief for all your troubles, and you'll be strong in whatever work you do. And so that's really what my hope for all of you, and for myself, kind of selfishly, is that we have the strength to cope with what is very difficult material to work with. But I encourage everyone to seek ways to engage in self-care and in community resilience, particularly for Lebanon and Syria, but also in Israel and Palestine, and in this country that is enduring a real reckoning with narratives and legacies of trauma. And so thank you.
Thank you so much. We probably have time for one or two quick questions.
I'm sorry it took so long. And this wasn't even the version of the paper I wanted to give you guys.
Not a problem. Are there any questions from any audience members? You can take yourself off mute and ask them, or type them in the chat box, and I'd be happy to read them as well. Just a lot of praise and thank yous coming in.
I do want to mention, oh, go ahead, Sophie.
No, please.
I was just going to mention that the this project, people who have written books before, like this is the first book I've ever published. And some people talk about it as feeling like birthing a baby, like the book was a baby. And I did a emergency C-section for my twins. So I only had to labor for a little bit, but I think it's like, it's a different process because this is so sad. Whereas my children bring me joy. I mean, sometimes, I'm like, time out, but this is like, it's hard. I think I'm a very empathetic person, and I have a kind of a, when I did that thing with Rachel for the Institute for Ethical Leadership, and I took that test about my strengths, my strengths finder, one of my things was context. And connectedness. So I think of everyone in the world as connected, like we're all on this rock hurtling through space together. Let's not, screw it up, but it was very hard for me to finish this project. And I found myself kind of falling into negative kind of coping mechanisms and having nightmares and imagining, one time Owen was like asleep in his, car seat. And I was like, he looks just like that dead child I saw in that movie. And I'm like, stop it. It's like, it can be really hard to work with this material. And I, as an educator, I struggle with how to speak about it in classrooms and in venues like this, where I'm like, here's a whole bunch of sad stuff, go off and have the rest of your day. And it's like, I hope that, people think of it as an opportunity to become more involved in building compassionate societies. And one time when I was so upset about this, I like went on Facebook and I was like, everybody, I made this for instead of Adam and Owen's birthday presents, please just donate to this international medical group that was working in Syria. And like within 48 hours, friends of mine like Emily and other folks had donated the entire amounts that I had asked for. And I even got, I think it was, I can't even remember now, Doctors Without Borders or International. They even posted a thank you to me on Facebook. And I was like, anything else I can do so I don't have these nightmares and feel like all I'm doing is like writing in my comfortable house with no bombs falling. And it's hard to work on this stuff. And it's, my dream is that my book tour will end with like the Senate Foreign Relations Committee like shaking my hand and being like, yes, we're going to fix this, thank you. But I know that's not going to happen. But I recommend people read up and heal and find ways to not carry the pain when we shouldn't be doing that. That's not productive. I get teary-eyed just thinking about it. But yes, I'm glad I'm going to autograph yours, Emily, next time I see you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this work. Thank you for doing this work. I know I speak for everyone here when I say that it's just so eye-opening and illuminating, and it's an important conversation to have. So thank you for bringing that to all of us. Before I let everyone go on this Friday afternoon, I'd love to give a little plug about our next faculty lecture, which is in 2 weeks on Friday, March 19th, featuring Professor Eti Terem, who's a professor of history at Rhodes College, and her topic is Islamic revival and reform in colonial Morocco. So we're going not so far away from Syria and Lebanon, just hopping over on the map to Morocco in 2 weeks. The registration is online. I'd be happy to share it with everyone after this call as well. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for sharing your material with us, Beverly. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Bye. Go drink some chamomile tea and listen to soothing music. And yeah, that's what I'm going to do right now. Bye. Shabbat Shalom.
Bye, everyone.